I went through all 32 NFL teams to figure out exactly how the coaches affect your fantasy football teams. Today's episode, the Dallas Cowboys. So let's take a seat. Class is in session. First, we need to identify how this team has changed. Has there been any coaching changes? For the Cowboys, they got a new OC, Brian Schottenheimer. He, like Mike McCarthy, both specialize in quarterbacks. He spent time with the Redskins, the Chargers, the Jets, the Rams, the Colts, the Seahawks, and the Jaguars. Shifting back over to Mike McCarthy a little bit to give you a little bit more insight on him, he spent time with the Chiefs, the Saints, the 49ers, the Packers, and now the Cowboys. And if you couldn't tell by this coaching staff, they've been around for quite some time now. On the defensive side, we still got Dan Quinn heading in the front. This team didn't lose too many crazy pieces in the offseason, but to me, from what they did in free agency and via the draft, they seem to have filled those gaps rather nicely. The only real question mark that we have here is the tight end position, but when we look into the overall coaching history here, that's not going to be the zenith of what they kind of characterize themselves around. Now that we've laid the foundation for exactly how the Cowboys have addressed this offseason, we can start to dive into exactly how that affects our overall fantasy teams. But before we do that, we need to talk to the guy upstairs to figure out exactly how the Cowboys are projected to land this season so that we can give our knowledge a little bit more structure to it. Cowboys are currently projected to get somewhere between 9 and 10 wins, and honestly, it makes so much more sense for them to get far more than that. I know a lot of people are going to be very optimistic about the Eagles this year, and I am too. But I also know that the Eagles had one of the absolute easiest schedules last year. And considering how high everyone is on the Eagles at this particular moment in time and how everyone's just kind of like pushing the Cowboys to the wind, I'm going to actually take the Cowboys going in first in this division. And honestly, I got a feeling that if Dak Prescott stays healthy, they're going to make the Super Bowl. This is honestly around where consensus has the Dallas Cowboys landing, but a little bit more optimistic than most. Now that we've got a really strong understanding of the general direction in which the Dallas Cowboys are built this season, we can figure out exactly how Mike McCarthy and Brian Schottenheimer affect our fantasy football teams. Starting off with the quarterback position, Dak Prescott. We've talked about Justin Fields, we've talked about Deshaun Watson, and now we're talking about Dak Prescott. Those are the three guys that I absolutely love to be dark horse QB1s for this fantasy season. I mean, had Dak not got injured last year, it could have genuinely been possible. The guy's got weapons all around him. The team's amazing. They've got a really nice ebb and flow to their overall game, and they kind of fit my perfect median build for that kind of guy that is going to be the quarterback one. Now, we're really going to put him in a similar projection that we have Deshaun Watson for the season in that 21 fantasy point range, but honestly, I'm going to give him a little bit of a boost and kind of go up to that 21 to 22 fantasy point range. The only reason I'm doing this is because we're seeing more of a general uptrend in this overall direction. The only kind of cause for potential concern is the new type of Texas Coast offense that they're going to be implementing. But if you're anything like me, you're going to be a little bit more optimistic when you hear something like that. The reason why I'm telling you to be a little bit more optimistic is it means they're going to be passing the ball a lot more, meaning there's a lot more upside for potential passing touchdowns. The only kind of concern that I have with that, though, is that apparently it's been a little bit hard to hear Mike McCarthy through his Pittsburgh accent. But to me, that's here and there. That's something that they'll figure out quickly. It would be pretty funny to be hearing that, like, the reason they lost a game was because Dak couldn't understand Mike McCarthy through his accent. Moving over to the RB1 spot, and that is Tony Pollard. There's no real direction which I can fully understand of where this running back total is really going, but I think an 18 to 19 fantasy point average makes a lot of sense here. I do think there's a world where we see Tony Pollard averaging more than 20 fantasy points per game, but I'm going to play a little bit more on the safer side and have him projected that 18 fantasy point per game average. To me, at this current point in time, I think he's fairly priced. Moving over to the RB2, and that is theoretically Malik Davis. This seems to be an overall uptrend, but to me, I think it's more safe to assume that it's going to be about an 8 fantasy point per average position. And if you want to kind of punt it all the way down, you can get him literally into the last round of your draft. I don't think anyone's touching him at this particular second in time. Moving over to the wide receiver 1, and that is CeeDee Lamb. There's a genuine possibility that CeeDee Lamb could be averaging 20 plus fantasy points this season, but I think that's a little bit outside of our reach. Although this offense is theoretically going to be more pass heavy, I think an 18 fantasy point per game average seems a lot more likely. Moving over to the wide receiver 2, and definitely a guy that's a bit underpriced right now, and that is Brandon Cooks. The wide receiver 2 in this offense typically tends out to do pretty well. Seeing Brandon Cooks fall into the 7th round here, I do think he might be a little bit overpriced, but a guy that could potentially be averaging somewhere between 13 to 14 fantasy points per game, not too bad of a spot to grab him. I just typically tend to lean more towards my wide receiver 1s because I think that has a lot more upside for me personally. So if you want to swing towards Brandon Cooks, I totally get it, but I'm not going to be buying him too much at that price, depending upon how it swings my way. Moving over to the wide receiver 3, and we have Michael Gallup. These totals lean to me that they're in overall upward direction, but not something that I'm going to be getting too excited about. I think an average between somewhere in 8 and 9 fantasy points per game makes a lot of sense to me. And I also wouldn't be too surprised if we see someone else land in that wide receiver 3 role this season. Moving over to the tight end position, it is currently slotted to be Jake Ferguson. Now, under Brian Schottenheimer, we have most certainly seen at least one elite tight end. But I wouldn't be getting too optimistic about that. I think going somewhere between 9 to 10 fantasy points on an average makes a lot more sense going off the trends here. Does that mean he's a buy? Potentially, but I also think you're trying to figure out exactly who they want running in that tight end 1 role at this moment in time. Overall, I'm very optimistic about this Dallas Cowboys team. I think that they could easily be Super Bowl contenders. I think we're going to see a lot of eliteness out of them in terms of fantasy. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of buying times for them as well. I think the thing we need to be most curious about as fantasy managers here is seeing exactly how this Texas Coast offense works out. To expand on that a little bit more, it's about a 70% focus on the West Coast style, meaning that there's going to be a higher emphasis on passing overall, which makes that higher level of upside for somebody like CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and realistically Tony Pollard. So overall, we're going to see something a little bit different than we typically have seen from these coaches before, which is going to be very intriguing. The reason I'm not too worried about the potential changes that are coming here is because you have a lot of experience in this coaching staff. These guys have been there and they've done it before. And more than anything, I'm stating that they've been in the league for over 20 years now. You can't just do that by being terrible. And if you can, then great job for being a con artist. I don't know how else to put it. But let me know what you guys thought of this video. Make sure to drop your fantasy football questions down below. I want to make sure to answer them as quickly as possible. If you like today's video, make sure to drop a like down below. If you want to stay up to date with the future things coming up, make sure you subscribe down below. We're dropping a video on the Denver Broncos tomorrow. In the meantime, thank you guys for everything. Peace.